Welcome to the 8th video field guide to edible and medicinal plants. In this video, we're going to cover 8 plants that are edible and or medicinal, as well as cover 2 poisonous plants. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. If your mother was a hamster, your father probably smelt of these. That's right, we're talking about the common elderberry. Here in the back we can see another elderberry bush. An elderberry is a very common bush that you're going to be finding along the edges of roadsides, railroad tracks, power line clearings, and all kinds of open, clear places. You can find them in old fields, even on old farms. So make sure whenever you are foraging your elderberry that you're not harvesting it from any location that could possibly be contaminated. If we look at this bush here, we can actually see or get an idea of how tall this thing actually can get. This thing can get anywhere from 9 to 11 feet tall, and in some cases much higher. So keep that in mind that your elderberry can be in various heights. This one that we're looking at in front of us is about 7.5 to 8 feet tall. First off, whenever you're looking at your elderberry, you're probably going to notice these huge umbels of white flowers. And there are numerous flowers on here, possibly in the hundreds of these white flowers. Let's take a closer look at this flower. The flowers of your elderberry are going to be white with 5 petals, and we can see these yellow pistils and stamens coming here out of the center. Whenever you look at the leaves of your elderberry, you're going to notice a couple of variations. These are technically a compound leaf, and they will have anywhere from 5 to 11 leaflets. On this one, for example, we can see 9. This is another one of the variations that you're going to see. We're on the very back towards the base where the leaf stem connects to the main stem of the plant. You're going to notice these extra little lobes, basically. Now this all is one leaf. It looks like it's multiple leaves, but this is what's called a compound leaf with leaflets. And we can see all these little leaflets here. If I flip this droopy guy around, we can see even more, and we can actually see the top one is split off into another little sort of lobe. So you are going to notice a few variations within the leaves of your elderberry. Whenever we look at the margins of our leaves, we're going to notice these very fine serrations running all along the margins of the leaves. The top of the leaves are going to be this very dark, kind of shiny green that we can see here, and the underside of the leaves is going to be a somewhat lighter green, kind of a greenish gray color that we can see on this one here. Whenever we look at the stem of our elderberry, we're going to notice that it is green and round, and it has these little kind of nubs all over them, these little brownish purplish nubs all over it. And if we look at the node, we're going to see a little bit of purple splotching that we can see here on this node right here. You're going to notice also that this is where some of the leaf branches are starting to come out. So this plant, or bush actually, has a opposite leafing pattern instead of an alternating leafing pattern. So make sure you keep that in mind whenever you are looking at your elderberry. It has a very stiff stem, but it breaks extremely easily. It's actually very juicy and succulent whenever you break it open inside, so make sure that you wash your hands very well after you've broken any of these stems to get any of the potential toxins off of your skin. This is an exceptionally common plant that you're going to be finding all across North America. There are a couple different varieties of daylily that you're probably going to be finding. Now this excludes the hundreds of different hybrid varieties, but there are 2 main edible ones. One is the orange daylily that we're looking at here, and then the other would be the tiger lily. There are a couple of ways to tell these apart. One of those is the tiger lily will have spots inside of the flower petals, versus on this one, if we look, there are no spots. Whenever we look at the flowers of the orange daylily, we're going to notice that there are 6 petals, and they are orange like the name implies, with this white stripe going through the center of each petal. Another thing we're going to notice is that as we get down towards the throat of the flower, it will terminate into a yellow center, just like we can see here. The pistils or stamens of this flower are very long, and they stick straight up, just like we can see on this right here. Right over here we can see a pod of one of the young flowers right here. Let's take a look at the leaves of this plant. If we look at the ground near the base of the plant, we're going to notice these very long grass-like blades. These are the leaves of our orange daylily. So this is an extremely easy plant to identify. If we look at the backside of the leaves, we're going to notice this very prominent midrib or vein running through the center of it. And if we look at the top of it, it might be a little hard to notice here. Let me zoom in to see if I can get this better. If we look at the top of it, it actually kind of V's in from the top. It's got a somewhat of a V-like shape to these leaves. They are generally somewhat pale green in color. They're not going to be dark green like we can see on this leaf over here. You can see this very, very contrasted, almost neon lime green sort of color. And this is very common of these leaves this time of year in the very end of June. All parts of this plant are edible, from the leaves to the flowers to these pods, the stems, and the roots. The roots are generally the most prized portion of the plant because they generally taste the best. So I wanted to let you guys know that this plant is edible and it's extremely delicious. The roots of this plant have been prized in China for thousands and thousands of years. This plant has been eaten by people for just as long, if not longer. There are several hybrid varieties of lilies that you might find in gardens and garden centers. Keep in mind that not all of those are edible. This one and the tiger lily are definitely edible, so keep that in mind whenever you are out foraging, if you plan on going foraging for any daylilies. We can see this rather tall plant growing here in front of us with all these kind of little flower buds coming out of the top. This is known as prickly lettuce. This is one of the several different species of wild lettuce that you're probably going to be finding all across the United States. This is an extremely easy plant to identify, and it does have some great medicinal uses that we're going to be talking about with this plant. Now this time of year, around from April, May, all the way through August, you're probably going to be noticing this very tall plant with these very distinct flower buds coming up out of the top here. If we take a closer look at the stem here where these flower buds are coming out, we're going to notice there are numerous flower buds all across this stem. And if we look, we're going to notice multiple stems with multiple flower buds. If we look really closely at some of these flower buds this time of year, we're going to notice some of them might be closed, but we can actually see the color of these here, and they are yellow, kind of like a light dandelion color. Now these flowers are obviously closed, but whenever they're open, they're going to be in a ray-like shape, with anywhere from 15 to 20 petals on each one of these flowers. Now after your wild lettuce flowers, you're going to notice these little fuzzy kind of seeds. These are the actual seeds of the wild lettuce. A lot like dandelion, this plant has the exact same strategy as dandelion for pollination and seeding itself through the wind. If we take a close look at this, we can actually see just how fuzzy it is, just like you would expect to see on a dandelion after a dandelion has flowered. If we look very closely at the stem where the leaves join, we're going to notice that the leaves are clasping, just like we can see how it clasps around the outside of the stem. The leaves will alternate, going back and forth on both sides. And we're going to notice this alternating leaf pattern on every stem. We can actually see several different types of leaves. So let's take a quick look at some of these types of leaves here. Here towards the very top of the plant, we're going to notice that the leaves actually get smaller and they get a lot more ovate in shape, or almost egg-shaped, if you will. We're also going to notice this very prominent mid-vein or midrib running down the center of each one of these leaves. It's very, very bright light green versus the dark green contrasts very well with these leaves. As we get further towards the bottom of the plant, we're going to notice a different set of leaves here. We can also see just how much bigger these leaves actually get compared to the ones at the top. We can also notice this prominent midrib running through, just very, very distinct. However, this plant gets its name from these prickles running along the midrib that we can see here and running along the margins of the leaves. These prickles are very, very stiff. They're not going to hurt you unless you press really, really hard, but even then it probably won't hurt too bad. They actually kind of break off and bend fairly easily. We're going to notice that the leaves are very, very deeply lobed. They're very, very long and elongated. They look similar to a dandelion leaf. And at the very tip, we're going to see multiple lobes here towards the tip getting smaller and smaller versus these sharp divisions that we can see right here spreading along each one of these lobes. As we continue to go up the plant from the ground, we're going to notice a whole lot of leaves coming out. And remember that alternating leaf pattern that we discussed. If we look closely in some of these nodes, we're going to notice some of these small little leaves coming out of each one of these nodes at the base. Now as we get a little bit higher on the plant, like I said earlier, these leaves are going to get smaller and they are going to change shape a little bit. You can see there's not near as many lobes on this one as there is on the basal leaves. So make sure you keep that in mind. Now this is a Lactuca species, which means it's known for this lactating quality. If I were to pull this leaf off, if I pull that leaf off, you can actually see this milky latex-like sap coming out of it. Now this sap actually has a lot of medicinal uses as being a good pain reliever, so make sure you keep that in mind. There are several different parts of the wild lettuce plant that you can use for food or medicine. These flower buds, before they actually open and create these little yellow flowers, can actually be boiled and eaten kind of like you would broccoli. It's absolutely delicious, boiled for about 5 to 10 minutes. And honestly, I found usually 5 minutes to be just the right amount of time. I don't like it more than 10 minutes because I think honestly, it reduces it too much and it doesn't taste near as good. So make sure you keep that in mind to not overboil these flower buds. You might notice after touching it and getting that sap on you that the sap is kind of sticky. You can see the sort of sticky nature on my fingers here. That stickiness of the sap can actually be used to help peel off warts slowly over time. So if you were to have a wart on your finger, you could actually apply some of this sap to the wart and then peel the sap off, and eventually over time the wart will come off. This doesn't work on every wart, but it is possible. Now if we look here, we can actually see one of the younger prickly lettuce plants that's growing in this area. And we're going to notice a little bit of a variation, not only in the leaves, but also on the stem. If we look at the stem on the younger plants, we're going to notice these spines running along the length of the stem. We can see those little spines along the margins of the leaves and on the midrib as well on the top of the frame. Now if we look at the base of this younger prickly lettuce plant, we're going to notice that the leaves actually look a lot different. These aren't nearly as deeply lobed. There are little bitty lobes on them, but they're not near as deeply as lobed as the ones that we see towards the top or that we've seen on the more mature prickly lettuce plant. So keep in mind that there are several variations of leaves that you're going to be finding. In the early spring, this plant is just a basal rosette, which a lot of people will confuse with dandelion. I'll show a picture of that up here on the right-hand side of the frame. You can actually boil these leaves whenever they're young, and then you can eat them as a food, just like you would like a spinach or a dandelion green. They are absolutely delicious, and you aren't going to get any of the pain-relieving effects if you boil it and eat the leaves. So make sure you keep that in mind. If you're going for a pain reliever, you do not want to boil these and eat the leaves. You actually want to make a tea out of these leaves, and you want to use that sap. There are several wonderful videos on YouTube on how to make a good pain reliever out of this plant. Now you guys may remember on that younger prickly lettuce plant that we looked at, there were a lot of spines along the stem. This one, as we can see, those spines are pretty much gone. And this is something that you're going to notice in your prickly lettuce plants as they get older and taller and a lot more mature, like we are on this one here. This plant can get extremely tall. It can get anywhere from 5.5 to 7.5 feet tall, but I usually find it at about this height, which is about 6 feet. Wild lettuce often grows in fields, clearings, on the edges of lawns, like we can see here on the edge of a lawn here in a local park. And we can actually see this wild lettuce, sticking up right there. We can see some of the other ones that we were just looking at over there underneath it. And we can see this is the normal type of environment that you're going to be finding your wild lettuce in. If we look here in front of us, we can see another really tall wild lettuce plant. This one is about 7 feet tall. This guy is extremely tall. Like I said, I normally don't find them this high, but they can get to that height. Whenever you're looking at this plant from a distance, it's a lot easier to see how big these leaves can get and that prominent white, almost white-like midrib or midvein running through the center of the leaves with this alternating leaf pattern. It's a very, very easy plant to identify, and honestly, this guy sticks out like a sore thumb in the environments that it grows in. These white spikes of lovely little flowers that we're looking at are the flowers of the white sweet clover. This is an extremely easy plant to identify, and it's very commonly found along the edges of fields and also in clearings on the edges of trails. You can find this on the edges of wood lines. Might even be able to find it in your lawn if you let it grow long enough. So let's take a look at some of its identification features. The leaves of the white clover are going to be just like most of your other clovers, except we're not going to notice that white chevron that we're used to seeing on like red clover, for example. If we look very closely at the margins of these leaves, we can see that they are slightly serrated, so there's a little bit of serrations on the margins of these leaves. There are a few different types of leaves that you're going to be seeing on your white sweet clover. One of them is going to be these big, kind of larger leaves that we're looking at here. And then once we get higher up to the top of the plant, and then once we get up towards the top of the plant, we're going to notice that the leaves actually get a lot more narrow and linear in shape. So I wanted to let you guys know there are a couple varieties of leaves that you're going to be seeing on this plant. If we look at the stem of our white sweet clover, we're going to notice it's very plain, smooth, and round. It's actually somewhat stiff and wood-like, kind of woody in feel and texture. So keep that in mind as well. If we look at the leafing pattern, we're going to notice that the leaves grow in an alternating pattern off of the main stem like we can see here. And at the top of each plant, you're going to notice numerous spikes of these white flowers. These things are absolutely lovely. They are extremely small though, so I cannot show these flowers in any major detail. They do not look a lot like your regular clover flower that you would find in your yard. However, there is a little bit of similarity. Now we can see the environment that is representative of where white sweet clover will grow. Right here in front of us, we can see all these little white spikes, and this is the white sweet clover that we were just looking at, or at least part of it actually. I had to take part of it off so I could film it because it's incredibly difficult to film this plant just because of the way that it grows. Your white sweet clover will grow anywhere from 4 to even all the way up to 7 feet in height depending on its location and the competition around it. This one that we're looking at here, and we can't even see the top of it, is about 5 feet high. The white sweet clover does have a couple of really good culinary uses. These leaves that we're looking at can actually be used as a vanilla substitute. They have a substance called vanillin inside of them, and that is the actual flavor component of vanilla extract. So you can actually use these leaves to make a vanilla-like extract, or you can use them as a vanilla-like seasoning for various baked goods as well. You can also make a really nice vanilla-flavored tea from these leaves. So this has a couple of really nice uses to it. The flowers of white sweet clover can also be used for a tea. They do have a little bit more of a florally taste to them. However, if you combine these flowers with the leaves, you're going to get a really nice florally and vanilla-like tea. So this is a really delicious beverage, especially chilled on a nice hot summer day, which is when this plant is in season. The plant that we're looking at right now is poor man's pepper. This is a very common plant that you're going to find around in your lawn, on the side of roads. You're going to find it probably on the edges of your garden, edges of other landscaped areas, and other various places, even in waste areas. So be careful if it's in an area that does have a lot of waste. You don't really want to forage it from those locations. Now let's take a quick look at some of the identification features of poor man's pepper. The first thing that we're going to notice this time of year whenever we look at our poor man's pepper is these tiny little flowers. These flowers are growing in what's called a raceme. And then right beneath that we can see these little round seed pods. And this is the part that is generally used as a pepper substitute. It is a very delicious pepper substitute, and I enjoy using this plant in soups and stews, especially on roasted meats as well. It's really, really good peppery and pungent flavor. I really enjoy these seed pods. If you're going to use these seed pods, you do want to use them when they are green, because whenever they get brown, they lose a lot of their flavor. We're going to notice that the flowers are white, and these flowers are going to grow always above all of the seed pods. These flowers do have 4 petals. Oh, sorry about the wind. As we look at this raceme of flowers, we're going to notice there are a lot of flowers on this raceme, as we can see here. This stalk with these seed pods will actually grow several inches in height. Right now, as you can see, it's really, really tiny. It's about the size of my thumbnail. But this will continue to grow till it gets several inches in height, and you can get hundreds of seed pods per plant. So it can be a really, really good resource to have if, let's say, you run out of pepper in your kitchen and it's too late and you have a bunch of this in your yard. I use this in the pinch all the time. I absolutely love eating this plant. As we notice, if we look here, we can see some flowering tops coming out here, 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 and here, and here. And each plant will do this multiple times. So you can actually get a whole lot of these seed pods from this plant. So this is a really, really good resource if you need some extra pepper. Whenever we look at the leaves of poor man's pepper, we're going to notice these toothed serrations, these toothed margins that this has. And there are a couple other different species of poor man's pepper plants. One of them is called cow pepper or pepper grass. Those species are not going to have these very, very sharp serrations on the margins like we can see here. However, they are usable in the same way, so keep that in mind. Another thing we're going to notice if we look at the leaves is these leaves are very dark green on the top, and they're almost the same color on the underside, so there's not much variation in the underside or the top side of these leaves. We're going to notice that the leaves of your poor man's pepper are going to grow in an alternating pattern up and down the stem. Now, there are a couple of different variations of leaves that you're going to find on this plant. The higher up you go, the more the leaves are going to alternate. The lower that we get on the plant, we're going to notice the leaves not only get larger, but the toothed serrations also become way more prominent, and we can see just how sharply divided these leaves are. Also, towards the bottom of the plant, you're going to notice in the nodes, you're going to see more of these leaves coming out, just like we can see down here. All these different little leaves coming out. These leaves are stalked, as we can see this large petiole coming in the very center of the frame right here. Now here we can see a smaller poor man's pepper plant, and we can see, as we look at this long stalk that it's got here, we can see all these different leaves coming out. Some of the other species of your poor man's pepper or cow pepper or pepper grasses as they're called, though they're not really grasses, will have this very large stem. Now this one doesn't look very big now, but they can also get much, much bigger. Let's go take a look at one of those. Right now we can see a much larger poor man's pepper plant, and you can see just how big this stem gets and just how many of these leaves this plant will produce. So I wanted to show you guys that there are various growth forms and variations that you're going to find within this plant. Spiny leaf sow thistle is a very common plant that you're going to find around your lawn, garden, on the edges of your yards, on the edges of fields and waste places, and even on roadsides. If we look at the top here, we can see all these little bitty flower buds coming out. We can see some, like the one in the center of the frame right now, has already flowered, and there are some in the process of still flowering. If we look at the very top, we're going to notice all these different stems coming up with multiple flowers. Each one of these stems can produce up to 5 flowers per stem, so you can get a lot of flowers off of this plant. This plant has numerous ray-like flowers, as we can see here, that look a lot like dandelion flowers, except they are much, much smaller. Now let's take a look at the leaves of our spiny-leaved sow thistle. When we look at the leaves of our spiny sow thistle, there's a couple things that we need to keep in mind. One is that the leaves are going to clasp the stem just like we can see right here, how they clasp around this stem. You can see the leaf actually goes down underneath, the petiole of the leaf goes down underneath the top portion of the leaf. If we look along the margins of this leaf, we're going to notice all these little spines everywhere. This is partially where this plant gets its names, and like many other thistles, have these spines. The higher up that we get on the plant, we're going to notice that these leaves get much, much smaller. So from the ground level, the plant leaves are going to be very large, and up at the top, they're going to get smaller and smaller. Another thing we're going to notice on the leaves of our sow thistle is that the leaves will alternate going up and down the stem. Now there are some variations to these leaves. So let's take a look at the basal leaves of the plant so we can get an idea on what those look like. Right here we can see one of the basal leaves of our sow thistle. We can see this looks a lot more like a dandelion leaf. This one does have some of the prickles and some of the spines running along the margins, but they're not as stiff as the ones on the top of the plant, like on this leaf here or this leaf up here. So the higher up you go on the plant, the sharper and stiffer those spines are going to become. This is one of the variations of leaves that we can see on this plant. Let's take a look at one of these top leaves for comparison. If we look at some of the leaves higher up on the plant, we're going to notice that the leaves actually become more lanceolate or more lance-shaped, and that's one of the variations that we're going to see compared to this leaf right here with very, very dull lobes that we can see. It's got these kind of little lobes on it, kind of like a dandelion, but it's not as sharply lobed as a dandelion leaf is. If we look at the underside of the leaves, we're going to notice that they are lighter in color. And if we look at the petiole, we're going to notice this red sort of tinging, red pinkish tinging along the meristem or the midrib of the leaf. Here's another one of the variations of leaves that we can find. If we look at this one, we'll notice that it does have more lobes than the other one that we looked at earlier. We can also see the spines running along the margin here, and these are extremely stiff. You can see how stiff that is. And if you poke them, they are going to hurt you. Here we have one of the basal leaves off of another one of these sow thistle plants that we've been looking at. And this gives you guys an idea of just how large these leaves can get. And this is right from the base. So there's going to be a lot of variation not only in size, but in shape. As we noticed earlier, the leaves on the very top of the plant can get extremely small versus the ones on the bottom, as you can see, are quite large. This guy's about the size of a small to medium sweet potato. Now your spiny leaf sow thistle will flower anywhere from April all the way up until August or September, depending on your location. It does have a very long flowering season, but once a specific plant flowers, it'll be in flower for about a month. So keep that in mind that each different colony of sow thistles will flower at a probably different time. So make sure you keep that in mind. These little tufts are actually kind of interesting. Mainly because these are the seeds, but also because they can be used for the tips of blowgun darts. You can use it for the little end of the blowgun dart to help keep it secure in a blowgun. And this is one of the very popular ways that Native American tribes used to use the fluffs off of various thistle species. If we look at the stem of our spiny leaf sow thistle at the top, we're going to notice these little nudges, these little almost like spines, but they're not really spines and they're not really hairs. I call them little nudges, because they're kind of bristly, but they're not sharp or pokey in any way. We're also going to notice that the stem is light green and perfectly smooth, minus those little nudges. However, this is from the top of the plant. Once you get to the bottom of the plant, a little lower, we're going to notice those nudges start to disappear. The spiny leaf sow thistle will get anywhere from about 3 foot all the way up to about 4, maybe 4.5 foot in height. But that's really rare. I usually find them anywhere from about 2 to 3 feet in height. Here we can see various spiny sow thistle plants that we can see some are in the process of flowering and some are in the process of producing their seeds. These seeds will go and drift along the wind just like a dandelion would. The spiny leaf sow thistle can get to about 3.5 feet in height. I have seen them get to about 4 or even 4.5 feet in height, but that is more rare than it is common. So keep that in mind that it's not a very tall plant, but it's not also a very short plant either. These lovely little flowers that we're looking at here are the flowers of the Siberian honeysuckle. Whenever we look at the flowers of Siberian honeysuckle, we're going to notice that they resemble the flowers of Japanese honeysuckle. But if we look very, very closely, we can see that there is this one long petal that hangs down underneath all of it. And then we can see the pistils and stamens coming up from the center of it there. And if we look at the back sides of the flowers, we're going to notice that they're somewhat tubular in shape. And then they have these lobes on the petals here. You can see these 3 or 4 little lobes on these petals. The flowers are going to vary from white to this yellow color that we can see right here in my hand. I would have shown it on the bush, but the shadows are not really quite working out for me right now today. So there are 2 different colors of flowers that you're going to be finding on your Siberian honeysuckle. Now, unlike the Japanese honeysuckle, this plant grows in a bush form instead of as a vine form. Some people confuse the two because they just see honeysuckle flowers and they think they're one and the same. They very certainly are not one and the same. Now let's take a quick look at the leaves of the Siberian honeysuckle. Whenever we look at the leaves of the Siberian honeysuckle, we're going to notice that the margins of the leaves are smooth. They come to this very, very fine, almost sharp-like point here at the tip. The leaves are going to be ovate in shape or oval or teardrop shape almost because of this point. Another thing to notice is that the growth form of the leaves are going to be in an opposite pattern instead of an alternating pattern. If we look here, we can see these leaves are growing on opposite sides of each other. Now later in the year, this plant will produce berries. It'll produce perfectly circular berries, and those berries will grow on opposite sides of each node, almost just like where the leaves are. They'll be right in between the leaf nodes on the main stem. Now right here in front of us is the honeysuckle bush that we were looking at just a second ago. And you can see how big this bush gets. This plant is highly invasive, so it's one that you need to get rid of. This plant was actually brought over in the 1930s to help control ditch erosion, which it does that job very well, but it spreads insanely fast, and it's also notorious for killing off native plants. The honeysuckle is also notorious for being a tick habitat, so this thing does support the livelihood of ticks. So that's another good reason to keep an eye out for this plant. The Siberian honeysuckle usually blooms from the beginning of May all the way up until around the middle of June, depending on where you live. Here in central Indiana, for example, it usually starts to bloom at the beginning of May, and it'll continue to bloom throughout most of the month of May. Now that time is going to be slightly different the further north or south you are, so take that into consideration. Now the Siberian honeysuckle does have quite a few uses, and you can use it basically all the same ways that you would use Japanese honeysuckle. So you can use it for aromatherapy. You can also use it to ease the discomfort of sore throats. You can also use it to help get over a cold in combination with other herbs. This is a really good plant to know. It's also exceptionally hard to kill, so keep that in mind if you find this plant in your lawn or garden, that it is notoriously difficult to kill. These flowers, on the other hand, make a very delicious tea or syrup or even jelly. You can make a really nice flavored jelly out of these flowers, so keep that in mind as well if you're wanting to use this plant. This is an extremely easy plant to identify, but it's also one of the most deadly plants known to man. So it's extremely important to know how to identify this. You might notice that I'm not actually touching it too much, and that's generally because touching this plant can simply be enough to cause a rash or even spread some of its toxins onto your skin, which can then carry over later. So I'm not going to be touching this plant like I normally do. Let's take a closer look at these flowers here. Whenever we look at the flowers of water hemlock, we're going to notice that they are very sparsely populated in these umbels, kind of like an upside-down umbrella like you would expect to see with regular poison hemlock. You can see how much space there is in between each one of these stems, or bracts if you will, that lead off into this cluster of flowers. This is one of the major indicators of water hemlock. Now let's take a look at its leaves. Whenever we look at the leaves of water hemlock at the base of the plant near the ground, we're going to notice this compound structure, very similar to poison hemlock. These leaves are technically leaflets. All these what look like leaves are technically leaflets. These leaves are also much smaller than they are on regular poison hemlock, so keep that in mind. If we look really closely at them, however, we're going to notice these veins coming off at kind of like a 45-degree angle from the mid-rib. We can see the mid-rib here, and we can see these veins running at a 45-degree angle from the leaf. If we look at the tip of the leaf, we're going to notice that it comes to a very nice point, and we can see some of the teeth running along the margin of this leaf here in the center of the frame. Right here we can see some more of the leaves of our water hemlock plant, and you can see this compound structure that they have. And the higher up we go along the plant of our water hemlock, we're going to notice that these compound leaves get smaller and smaller, and we're going to see about 3 leaflets towards the top of the plant. This is about 2 to 4 inches from the top of the plant. And we can see these 3 to 4 little leaflets coming out here. We can also see more of those teeth margins and those veins that I was talking about. We can see those a lot more clearly here on this picture. Another thing we're going to notice if we look at the leaves, we're going to notice where these leaflets actually come out. We're going to notice another purple splotch like we can see in the center of the frame. If we look along the stem of our water hemlock, we're going to notice that it's round, green with this purple splotching or purple tinging that is just oh so common with your hemlock species. This is a really good indicator of a hemlock species. Now, I do want to mention there are some plants that have purple splotching that are not hemlock. Make sure you keep that in mind. If we look at the leafing pattern of our water hemlock, we're going to notice that it has an alternating leafing pattern, just like we can see here how these leaves will alternate up and down the stem. And in the nodes is where we're going to notice that purple splotching or that purple tinging, and the rest is going to be generally green. However, there is some variation with that. Here, if we look at the stem of this water hemlock, we can actually see that this stem is a lot more purplish red than the other one that we were just looking at. So there's not only a couple of variations to the leaves, there's a couple of variations to the stems that you're also going to be finding on your water hemlock plants. This white powdery substance is actually like a bloom. If you rub that, it will come off on your fingers. I'm not going to rub it because just simply touching this plant can be enough to spread its toxins. This is a very, very common plant that grows in moist woodlands, usually along with toothwort, trout lily, spring beauties, and trilliums. This plant flowers in the very early spring, as we can see here looking at this spike of flowers. It gets its name, Dutchmans Breaches, from the fact that these flowers actually look like upside down pantaloons that were worn by the Dutch in the early colonial days. Whenever we look at the flowers, we're going to notice that there are two petals that look rather inflated. If we turn this to the side, we can see they look kind of inflated. And at the bottom, we're going to notice two yellow spurs, just like we can see on the bottom of all of these right here. You're going to find a couple different colorations of flowers. Usually they're going to be white, but they can appear like this with this kind of whitish pink hue that we can see on this set of flowers right here. Each plant of Dutchman's Breaches can send up multiple spikes with multiple flowers on them like we can see on this one right in front of us. Let's take a look at the leaves of Dutchman's Breaches. Now right here we can see a set of the leaves on this Dutchman's Breaches plant, and if we look at them closely, we're going to notice that they're very, very finely dissected. These are compound leaves, and they're very finely dissected with a whole lot of divisions, just like we can see on this one right here. Let's take a closer look at some of these divisions. Right here is a really good close-up of all of these divisions in these leaves, and you'll notice that there are a whole lot of them. You're going to notice that they're not always divided in the same way, and the leaves are going to be kind of variable in the shape as we can look at these different sets here. And if we look at that one there and we look at the shape of that set versus the shape of this set, we're going to notice that they are a little bit different. These leaves are very, very soft. They're also very thin and very delicate. So make sure you keep that in mind when you're handling this plant, that the leaves are very delicate so you don't destroy it too much. If we flip it over, we're going to notice that the underside is a little bit lighter in green than the top side of these leaves. Now here we can see the rest of this Dutchman's Breaches that we've been looking at. We can see that spike of these flowers, and we can see these leaves growing here along the ground. We can actually see some other plants coming up over there, some more Dutchman's Breaches coming up there. We can see some back over here. Usually this plant will colonize an area, and wherever you find one, you're most likely going to find dozens, if not hundreds or thousands more, especially if you're covering a large area, like a few acres or just several miles. You're going to notice thousands of these guys. They're not rare by any means, at least within my state of Indiana. So let's talk a little bit about some of the variations of the flower colors here. Now, like I said earlier, the flowers are normally going to be white, like we can see on this spike with these flowers here. We can see just how white they really are. But you can also find them, like we saw earlier, with a little bit of a pinkish hue. So if you see these with this very distinct shape, upside down pantaloons, yellow spurs along the bottom, and two petals pointing upwards towards the sky, and they look to be inflated, you know you have Dutchman's Breaches, especially if you see those very, very distinct sets of leaves. One of the other flower colorations that you're probably going to find on some of your Dutchman's Breaches are here, where we can see they have this sort of whitish yellow appearance to them. So there are a couple different flower colorations that you're going to find on this plant, and we can see that the spurs on the bottom of these look almost green in color. So do keep that in mind when you're looking at your Dutchman's Breaches. They're not different species, it just has a couple of variations in its flower color. Now there are a few uses of this plant, but I do not recommend using it because it can be potentially poisonous, and some people are actually allergic to this plant, and it can give them skin rashes, and it can cause some stomach digestion and some bleh. And it can cause some stomach upset. So be careful if you decide to use this plant internally. I'm not going to talk about its internal uses because I've never used it internally, but there's some interesting little history about this plant. The Iroquois tribe actually used to use these leaves, and they would take them and they would make like a poultice to rub on athletes' legs to make them more limber. So I would assume it probably would work sort of like a topical muscle relaxer, though I've never used it for that at all. So I can't say how effective it is. Another interesting thing is the Menominee tribe used to use the root as a love charm. It was said that basically they would throw a root at somebody that they wanted to get in love with or fall in love with, and if they chewed the root, the breath, they would actually affect their breath, and that would attract people to them. Whenever you do find your Dutchman's Breaches, like I said earlier, you're going to be finding things like trout lily, toothwort, spring beauty, trilliums, and you can also find wood nettles coming up, usually in the same areas because they love moist, low-lying habitats. And if we look over here to our right, now right next to the Dutchman's Breaches that we were just looking at, we can see some of the early shoots of wood nettle. This is an amazingly delicious plant, and it usually loves growing in very, very moist habitats. So another thing you might also find in these areas could be potentially morels as well, if there are the proper trees in the area. While these wood nettles are edible in this stage, I personally like to wait till the leaves are a little bit bigger so you actually get some substance with them, because whenever you do cook them, they shrink quite a bit. But I did want to show those to you guys since I saw them here. Hey guys, I just wanted to bring you all a quick little video. I'm out here doing a little mushroom hunting, and I found this very beautiful plant with these white berries. They have these black spots on the end of them. Whoops, one of them just broke off. That's all right. Here we go. We can see at the end we've got these little white berries with these black spots at the end of them. The common name of this plant is doll's eyes because these look like, well, the eyeballs that you would find in a doll, like a childhood doll. Set that berry there because it's got seeds in it. We'll bury that dude up. But anyways, another name for this plant is baneberry. Now, if you guys might remember on my mock strawberry video, I also call mock strawberry baneberry. So that is not to be confused with this plant. Obviously, you can tell by looking at it, it looks nothing like a strawberry. But we can see these berries coming out of this here, and this is very common on this plant this time of year, right around the beginning of fall and the end of the summer. You're going to see these white berries coming on this very beautiful pink stem. We notice these berries are arranged in sort of like an alternating opposite sort of situation that they've got going on here. Really, really pretty, really pretty. All right, now right here we can see the leaves of the doll's eye plant. Now these are compound leaves, as we can see here. They are kind of dying and tinging off because of the colors. Good thing about this plant is that while it is poisonous, it's not going to hurt you just by simply touching it like this. However, do not consume these berries especially, but do not consume any part of this plant. If we look at these leaves, we're going to notice that there are 3 leaflets up at the top, and then we're going to notice 2 leaflets at the back, and they're going to be divided with different lobes. And if we also look very close, we can see that the margins are actually double-toothed margins. So this is a really easy way to identify this plant this time of year, is those berries. But we can also see the leaves are going to be a little bit variable. If we look at these back leaflets on this side, and when we look at this one right here, we can see it doesn't have any divisions like this one does. So if we compare that to These leaves over here, you can see how they're divided a lot differently than the other ones. So keep that in mind whenever you're looking at the leaves on this plant, that they do have some variation. Right over here, we can see some more of these leaves here. So this is a good idea of something to look out for. If you're wanting to find this plant, or you see it and you're curious about it, just keep in mind that it is highly poisonous, and do not consume this plant, especially the berries or the root. They are the most poisonous parts of the plant to my knowledge. So I just wanted to share that with you guys real quick while I'm out here doing a little mushroom hunting. So that concludes the 8th video field guide to edible and medicinal plants. I hope every one of you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned something. If you want to learn more about wild, edible, or medicinal plants, please make sure to subscribe.